Blood and Fury by Matthew Lynch falls under the category of books where I am most definitely not in the target audience group for the book. So I feel like I kind of need to give two reviews at once. First, how this book will work for those it was intended for. Second, how this book works for me. Flood and Fury takes a look at the stories of the flood in the days of Noah and the conquest of Israel during the days of Joshua. This book was an examination of those sections in the Bible for people in the church who would consider themselves on the progressive end. And what I mean by progressive is those who are willing to cut out portions of the Bible that they deem to either not be historically accurate or that would demean their view of God as they think he is presented elsewhere in the scripture. Now, I am not one of those people. I think the flood of Noah's day and the conquest of Joshua are in our Bible because they occurred in history in the manner presented in the Bible, and also as ways to teach us about God's character and his dealings with man. Now, I think there were some moments where Lynch had some genuine insight that I truly appreciated while reading. And there were other places where I was like, Matthew, you are basically denying that these stories happened at all. And I was not a fan of those moments. But let's discuss the good and the bad of Flood and Fury by Matthew Lynch. Welcome to Rev Reads, your home for book reviews from the perspective of a pastor. If you're new to the channel and want to discover more challenging and thought-provoking books, please subscribe to the channel to stay up to date with the most current reviews. If you're a regular to the channel, please like this video, share it with other people to help them learn about the work of Matthew Lynch. Now let's start by saying, if you know someone who is ready to take a razor blade to their Bible and cut out stories like the flood or Jericho, this might be a good book to draw them back in, to say, let's put down the knife and keep our Bible whole. Lynch does a good job to show that these are not the violent images of destruction and mindless killing of innocents as often seen or described by others. There is much to learn about God's peace and his plan in these stories. If you think God is immorally violent at places in the Bible, Lynch will help you to see why you need to give these stories a deeper examination yourself. And I really liked his advice that when we come to a passage of scripture, maybe one of those ones that kind of gross us out a little or make us question God's own reasoning, the best thing for those passages is to slow down. Meditate on why this story is in the Bible instead of flying past it in a hurry or just wishing that wasn't really there and so I'm just going to ignore it. God's peace shines bright on the backdrop of man's sin and darkness. His discussion on harem in the Hebrew, or the ban, where Israelite was called to kill every person and animal and destroy buildings, I thought that discussion was helpful. I do think that he's most likely close to being accurate for that term by saying that it's not talking about eliminating entire peoples and every person and animal in town, but it is referring to wiping out the armies of the Canaanites, not going into the town and taking out every baby. He has a lot of evidence in the Bible itself on how some of the places, it would just make no sense if Israel was going in from town to town and wiping out every living being. It would contradict with other places in the Pentateuch, Joshua, and Judges. His discussion on creation was also very helpful. It was a great way to start the book. He drove home the point that when we contrast the creation account in Genesis with the other creation accounts in the ancient Near East, the other accounts of creation are very violent. While Genesis, on the other hand, is an account of peace. It is very good, not very destructive. He paints a picture of how God's goal for the world is shalom, or peace. It's not about violence and conquest. And all of those points go together, and they could help bring someone back from the cliff who was saying, I just need to unhitch the Old Testament from the New Testament, and I need to get rid of all of that violence and terror, could bring them back to see that the Old Testament does have a lot to offer us today. All of the Bible is important. It teaches us about God, history, and how God interacts in history. You can't fully know the Lord without the Old Testament. And his section on Exodus 34 was great. I always love it when people turn to that on the importance of God describing his own character and his own goodness and justice. Now, that was some of the good in the book. Let's talk about some of the ugly. First, Lynch denies the worldwide flood, spends some time trying to dismiss it, and to that I say, thanks, but no thanks. I'm going to believe the flood took place as described in Genesis. Second, he kind of also denies the conquest in Joshua as well. Now, that isn't as explicit, but he undercuts a lot of the narrative in a way where I was really not a big fan. The third point that really bothered me was his chapter on violence against women. And that chapter was awful. I think he was trying to gain some points with those who want to tear down the patriarchy. And maybe if you're one of those people who thinks the patriarchy is awful, you might love that chapter. But his work was really built in the chapter on one little point in the Hebrew that's just not accurate in any way. Lynch makes the argument that when you see the word take in Genesis, in the context of a man takes a woman, that word take is violence against women. It is rape. And he brings it up throughout that chapter and then again at the end of the book. The problem is that when a man takes a woman, that is not the same as rape in the Old Testament. Now, it could be, but it also means either to just simply be married to someone or to have sex. It could be violent if the context indicates that it is, but none of the incidents in Genesis 1 through 11 where a man takes a woman is shown to be violent. You need to read that into the text. And just to make sure everyone watching this video is clear on my point about a man taking a woman not being a violent act, well, all of these instances I'm going to go through have a man taking a woman to be his wife. When Isaac married Rebekah, he took her. When Abraham married again after his wife Sarah died, he took Keturah. When Esau was married, he took his two wives. When Leah spoke of Rachel sleeping with Jacob, she actually says Rachel took Jacob. Obviously, Rachel wasn't raping him. Judah took his wife among the Canaanites, and finally, Moses' father took his mother. The word take is just simply referring to having sex or getting married. And there's no evidence that the sons of God were raping the daughters of men or forcing them into marriage, or even that the wives of Lamech didn't want to be married to Lamech and that they weren't happy to be married to the baddest guy on the block. My point is to say, one, that this chapter was pretty poor scholarship. It obviously got underneath my skin. And second, violence in Genesis is wrong, whether it's against men or women. We don't need a special chapter on male violence against women, and the basis for talking about male violence versus women in that chapter, it just really isn't there in Genesis. So there were places in the book where I felt like Lynch was driving me a little bit crazy, and I was not a fan at all. Other places where I really enjoyed his insight. Overall, I'm glad to have read the book for the good parts. The peace of God in creation was where he was at his best. That comparison of Genesis with the ancient Near Eastern accounts of creation were really good. But then the twisting of the word take into rape, that was where he was at his worst. So there were just ups and downs in this book. So first, I recommend this book for those who are comfortable reading things that you disagree with, if you are from my theological view. On the other hand, if you're someone who's thinking about cutting out the Old Testament as a whole, give Lynch a chance first. I just wish he would have taken some sections of the Bible by faith instead of discounting them in this book.